Once you were old enough, what were the dark family secrets you were finally let in on? My paternal grandfather was an alcoholic wife abuser who regularly cheated on grandma. When my father was a teenager, he stood up to him and threatened to kill him if he ever touched her again. The abuse stopped. Grandpa died while snorting coke and getting head in his Corvette. Cousin of mine's dad blew his own head off in the horse stall next to him while they were cleaning them. I was told about that at around 15 because I was going to spend some time with them, and was told not to mention their father. My grandmother tried to murder my grandfather when she got sick of him beating the shit out of her every day. She swung an axe at him and he blocked it with his hand and lost his thumb. She left him before I was born. My grandfather got out of serving in Vietnam by robbing pharmacies and going to jail for years. My grandfather's brother left the family business after a feud to sell tractor parts to Africa. When I was an adult, I was told these were semi-automatic tractor parts. My father cheated on my mom, with my sister and I's horse riding instructor. We'd always thought it ended amicably. We only found this out while mom was admitting to having contemplated driving off the road with us in the car as kids, as opposed to raising us as a single mom with no career or stable job. Added a comma to prevent hilarious confusions. That my cousin was actually my half-brother. Mom got pregnant in college and my aunt and uncle adopted him. And that my dad wasn't my biological father. Mom and dad got divorced, she got pregnant by another man, and my dad wasn't able to have kids of his own, so they got remarried and he raised me as his own. My uncle is believed to have murdered 2 Australian police officers in the late 80s. Apparently my aunt was the product of rape, but my grandma hasn't told anyone in the family yet except me. She just turned 90. I have no idea what I should do with this information once she passes. My grandma retired and she still decided to work for her brother in his restaurant to save up money for when she dies. Funerals are, obviously, expensive. She insisted he would hold on to her paychecks and pay for her funeral when she dies. He never did. My father always tells me as a joke that it's my fault my mom and him are married. I'm the second son, but through the years from drunk conversations and several sources have pieced the story together. My parents separated before they knew my mother was pregnant and only came back together after I was born. My mom had a brother who died in childhood, maybe 9 or 10. I always thought he drank cleaning chemicals and died that way, but turns out he was hit by a school bus while riding his bike. Now I know why my mom was so anxious about me biking on the road. The reason I had a live-in babysitter when I was 5 that moved in at 2 a.m. was because my mom's cousin killed 2 kids and we ended up harboring his daughter during the trial. He's the only person on death row in my county. My uncle and 2 aunts had an incestuous threesome going on in the 70s. They invited my mom, who refused and was pretty horrified. My dad, their brother, had zero idea. To put it shortly, my family tree is more like a very long branch. Yes, we have the genetic defects to prove it. My grandparents spent some time in lockup after my grandpa killed their newborn in a shell shock-induced frenzy. They were jailed because they buried her body in a cave and tried to hide it. My mom and her siblings were all adopted out very young and went back to their parents around 11 years or so later. I knew that growing up, but didn't know why until I was older. That my grandpa molested all the women in our family, not just me, and they let it happen because that's just what you do. My parents led me to believe that my grandfather, on my mother's side, had died due to a heart attack. A year later they revealed he actually shot himself in the head. My grandfather molested his children when they were young. My aunts and uncle didn't speak about it till they reached their 20s and 30s. They hid their experience to their siblings, but little did they know, they all experienced the same thing. They all suffered trauma but didn't tell my grandmother about it because she loves our grandfather very much. My dad's uncle died in a boating accident with his cousins. My family let me know he was possibly drowned in the middle of the lake by his cousins because of some money issues. No one was ever prosecuted though, and the family is still very close. Weird. Grandma didn't decide to move in with us because she loved us so much and wanted to spend more time with us. Grandma moved in because her son was a meth addict and convinced her to put his name on the house, take all the money out of it, for renovations, and leave her homeless. She had a heart attack the night she found out and now has to live with a pacemaker. Fuck you, Uncle Roy. My dad is in a cult. Wasn't much of a secret, but as a kid you just kinda assume everything your parents do is the norm. My father got my mother pregnant when he was her teacher in high school. He was 30 and married. She was 15 and his student. They ran off together, he got a divorce, and they got married in a state that allowed marriage at 16, 2 months before my older brother was born. Great uncle was taken from his parents, told he was retarded, wouldn't be right, put in state hospitals, experimented upon. Only thing wrong with him was a speech impediment. Grandma's top secret pie crust was actually just Marie calendars from the grocery store, set in a fancier dish. She messed with her daughters-in-law for years over it. My aunt started the Communist Party in her country. It got quite large, her children fled the country, and I still don't know what happened to her. There's a reason I didn't list the country. My uncle shot a man who was having an affair with his wife. When he was tried, he was let off the hook because the judge was my grandfather's war buddy in WW2. Side note, that judge was also one of the judges in the Manson trials. My mom was raped and my oldest brother is the product of it. We knew my bro was my half. Well, I found that out as a teenager. But my dad told me what happened after my mom died. My grandfather isn't my biological grandfather. My grandma was raped in high school with her not knowing who the original father was, so the man who would be my grandfather took it upon himself to raise a child you do not belong to him. I always thought my Uncle Dan died in a car accident. Turned out he owed a lot of money to a loan shark. He and his partner were asked to play Russian roulette and one survives can walk away and get an extension for payment. Uncle wasn't lucky. There was a big row with my uncle and another family which often broke into a fight. This was when I was about 10. Never understood what was going on and the scenes always left me shaken. Turns out my 40-year-old uncle got a 16-year-old pregnant that was working for him. My other uncle told me when I was much older. My mom is still in love with someone else who was executed when they were 22 feet. I'm starting to think my family is just boring. Kinda hard to compete with the fascist great-grandfather or the plethora of affairs. I didn't have an imaginary friend who moved. I had a twin brother who died from a bee allergy when I was too young to remember much. Just discovered recently my grandma had a 5th child. Put him up for adoption. IDK, the whole story is my grandma has passed on. My uncle has serious learning disabilities. It turns out that my nan tried to do a home abortion because she got pregnant by some guy while my granddad was away in the army. Mom committed suicide, presumably holding my hand. I was 1 year old at the time. My parents were going to abort me, but his friend stopped him. My dad named me after his friend. My dad and I have a great relationship now, though lol. My grandfather's brother suffered from depression. Yeah, back in the day, that was a pretty big black mark. Psychiatry wasn't what it is today, and no medications were available. He was once hospitalized, so that required cover stories. Sorry, I don't know more details. He died before I was born, so these events happened quite a while ago. At the funeral of my uncle, I learned that he became a monk after the death of his ex-boyfriend because of HIV. I was 20 at the time, and I never knew that he was gay or had HIV. To me he was just a weird but nice skinny monk I saw just a very few times. When I asked my parents why I had never heard of it, they said it was because I never asked, which is true. My parents never married out of love. It was more of a, we kind of like each other and this is pretty convenient, thing, and they kept up the marriage until we were old enough to be able to deal with it. I am honestly grateful they chose to give me and my brother a good childhood. My dad cheated on my mom with her sister. My great-uncle killed the sheriff of his small town after the sheriff raped his daughter. He hopped a train to Chicago from Tennessee to escape the Klan. He later returned to Tennessee a blind old man at 90 years old. All the files were moved to digital and he outlived all the police who would remember him. Died in 2000, rip Uncle Blue. Quite literally a dark family secret. Being a white-ass blonde-haired blue-eyed little rat bastard at 6 and finding out my bio dad is black. Funny enough, my best friend at the time was whiter than me with blonde hair, blue eyes, also had a black bio dad. I guess our moms were just super flocking white. My aunt steals desserts from buffets. I didn't know my grandmother and her family were interned during World War II until I was 12. I didn't even know internment existed before then, because the topic was avoided at all costs. My uncle died of a gunshot wound and it was ultimately ruled a suicide. The cops weren't sure though. The circumstances were apparently sketchy, but I don't know the details. The other theory they had was he might have been murdered by some people he did business with who had mob ties. My uncle was a gigolo and he might have continued that line of work as a married man. Proof of this was only discovered by my pops after my uncle's death nearly 30 years ago. My father has declined to talk to my aunt about this. Granddad is gay. Like no shit, he has 6 billion Polaroids of his cat and shares a bed with his best friend, for like 40 years. IDK, why they even attempted to keep that one a secret from me, lol. That pretty much every member of the family is dealing with some form of mental illness and is not being treated, especially the adults. When I learned that I was bipolar at 35, I was like, what the flock have all you people been doing your whole lives? This shit is real. Feeling much better these days since I got help. My psychotic great-grandfather shot my great-grandmother 9 times, and then turned the gun on himself. My great-grandmother miraculously survived, and even I was able to see her until she passed away from natural causes when she was 85. My great-grandfather always seemed off and had an extremely hot temper, from what I was told at least. Ah, that my dead brother Peter wasn't, really a person. My parents would always say when I was about to get into trouble, you know your brother Peter did THST and now no one knows where he is. I always had the fondest memories of my great-grandmother. My only memories of her were when she was feeble, lugging around an oxygen tank, but always smiling. She was under 5 feet tall and named after a flower. It wasn't until a few years ago, almost 20 years after her death, that I learned she killed a man and ran from the law when she was much younger. My uncle turned out to be my brother, and none of my other 3 brothers has the same biological father as me, or each other. Reading all these comments and thinking, damn, I got off easy. I got told the family recipe for a damn good Victoria sponge cake. Polish great-granddad was forced to drive trains full of Jews to the concentration camps. I'm told he killed himself because of it. At the age of 63, my grandmother found out that the man who had raised her wasn't her biological father. Turns out her biological father had gotten 2 women pregnant in 1943, abandoned them both, and never saw them again. By the time she found out, he had already passed away. The other child he had abandoned? My grandmother's best friend of over 40 years. My sister cheated on her boyfriend, and as an act of revenge her boyfriend slept with my mom. My sister is engaged to him now. That my father and mother were both fugitives. Oof, there have been a few. The best ones I can laugh about are, my great-grandma isn't my biological great-grandma, she's her identical sister. A month after my great-grandma died, her husband married her twin. No one talks about this. My kind old great-uncle with dementia was actually an arms dealer who maybe killed 2 people, still waiting on the full story there. My grandfather was gay and died of AIDS. He was patient number 17 in NYC in the 80s. I'm 40 now. I only found out last year. As did my 8 brothers and sisters. One of my great-aunts got arrested for trying to be intimate with a horse. Mom reminds me most times I go home to visit. This isn't dark, but my dad was that boring straight-up dad with not a lot of emotion and would scold me whenever he caught me smoking pot. Found out he spent like 3 years following the Grateful Dead and dosing all the time, ha ha ha. My good old grandpa who always made me toys and stuff used to viciously beat my grandmother and his son, my uncle, and I learned that only 3 years before he died. It makes a very conflicting view of a person. You have such fond memories of someone you should have such hate for. My mother and my uncle had slept together on numerous occasions. My aunt, uncle and 2 cousins lived with us for about a year when I was much younger, and I remember my mom and uncle having a very love-hate relationship. My aunt has always hated my mom. I talked to my sister pretty recently on why she thought that was. Turns out it was cause my mom was flocking her boyfriend. Mystery solved. My dad grew and sold marijuana to put me and my sister in private school and college. Take that college debt. Uncle Gibby killed a man drink driving and got away with it via a very expensive lawyer. It was 100% his fault, and this is why we suddenly stopped associating with him. What's with the quotes? Anyway, turns out my father raped my sister, so there's that.